They appeared at dawn. A large noose of men on horses and camels slipped around the Sudanese village of Bendi, located in the western Darfur region of the country, and slowly began to make their way forward. A slow trot became a canter, leading to a furious stampede that swept through the village. The attackers took their time, meticulously searching every property. Men and older boys are dragged outside and executed on the spot, while women and girls now had to face an entirely different horror as they were pulled into corners by their bloodthirsty attackers or violated in full sight. The attack on Bendi was savage, a version of hell that few of us will ever come close to experiencing, and yet for the people of Darfur, this was just the beginning. Sudan was in turmoil, with various uprisings across the country. In the coming years, the South would eventually break away to become South Sudan, but Darfur continues to experience violence and repression to this day. This genocide has gone remarkably underreported by the Western media, especially in the last decade or so. What happened in Bendi had already occurred to a lesser degree in Khartoum a month before, and would happen again in Mukjar and Tawila in the coming months. As people around Darfur began to flee the increasing violence, they found themselves in internally displaced persons or IDP camps throughout the region, but even there, things were not safe. Savage raids on camps dispelled any notion of security, and the deaths began to rise dramatically. At the center of it all were the mysterious men on horseback, hired assassins, rented rapists. This was the Janjaweed. The Darfur region of Sudan has long been a complex mix of ethnicities, tribes, and cultures. Located in the western part of Sudan, Darfur is home to a mix of Arab and non-Arab ethnic groups, including the Fur, Masalit, and Zaghawa tribes. Historically, these communities coexisted through a delicate balance of pastoralism and farming, with nomadic Arab herders and settled African farmers sharing the land and resources. However, this coexistence wasn't without its conflicts. Tribal disputes over land, water, and grazing rights have been a part of Darfur's history for centuries. These disputes were typically resolved through the traditional mechanisms of mediation and compensation. Yet, the latter part of the 20th century saw a dramatic shift in the region's stability. Environmental factors played a significant role in exacerbating these tribal conflicts. The Sahel region, including Darfur, experienced severe droughts in the 1970s and 80s. These droughts led to desertification, reducing the amount of arable land and pushing nomadic herders further south into farming areas. As resources dwindled, competition intensified, leading to more frequent and violent clashes between herders and farmers. The environmental degradation was compounded by economic neglect from the central Sudanese government, which focused its development efforts on the capital, Khartoum, and the eastern regions of Sudan. This neglect left Darfur marginalized and underdeveloped, fostering resentment among its inhabitants. The stage was set for a conflict that would soon escalate into one of the most brutal and yet little-known humanitarian crises of the 21st century. The Sudanese government's involvement in the Darfur conflict was pivotal in the formation and empowerment of the Janjaweed militias. In the early 2000s, the Sudanese government faced rebellions from two main groups in Darfur: the Sudan Liberation Army, SLA, and the Justice and Equality Movement, or JEM. These groups, representing the non-Arab ethnicities of Darfur, accused the government of oppressing black Africans in favor of Arabs and neglecting the region's development. To counter these rebellions, the Sudanese government adopted a divide-and-rule strategy, arming and supporting Arab militias to fight against the rebel groups. This decision was driven by the need to maintain control over Darfur and suppress any potential threats to the regime. The government provided weapons, training, and logistical support to these militias, which came to be known as the Janjaweed. Now, the term Janjaweed is derived from the Arabic words Jan, meaning devil, and Jawad, meaning horse, reflecting the group's reputation for brutality and their uses of horses and camels in their attacks. The government's backing gave the Janjaweed the resources and the impunity that they needed to carry out their campaign of terror against the civilian population of Darfur. The early formation of the Janjaweed was marked by a transition from loosely organized local militias who had operated for decades either in Sudan or in Chad to a more structured and formidable force. Initially, these militias comprised Arab nomads involved in local skirmishes over land and resources. However, with the infusion of government support, they began to organize more systematically and adopt more sophisticated tactics. Coordinated assaults on African villages characterized the Janjaweed's early acts of violence. These attacks were not random, but were part of a deliberate strategy to terrorize and displace the African population, thereby weakening the support base of the rebel groups. Villages were razed, men and boys were killed, and women were subjected to rape and other forms of sexual violence. These atrocities were intended to instill fear and force the African communities to flee their homes. One of the early acts of violence that highlighted the Janjaweed's brutality was the attack on the village of Kudum in 2003. The militia descended on the village, killing dozens of men, raping women, and burning houses to the ground. This attack was a grim precursor to the widespread violence that would soon engulf the entire region. A significant aspect of the Janjaweed strategy is targeting specific ethnic groups. Primarily, their violence is directed towards the Fur, Masalit, and Zakawa tribes. These groups are predominantly African and have historically been marginalized by the Arab-dominated Sudanese government. The Janjaweed, being Arab militias, have used this ethnic divide to justify their attacks, often under the pretext of quelling rebellion or protecting their own communities. However, the underlying motive appears to be ethnic cleansing, aimed at displacing these groups from their ancestral lands and erasing their cultural presence in the region. As the Janjaweed consolidated their power, their attacks became more frequent, more devastating. The militias began to operate with greater coordination, often launching simultaneous attacks on multiple villages. Their traditional attack plan included surrounding villages, cutting off escape routes, and launching surprise assaults at dawn. The use of horses and camels allowed them to move swiftly and cover large areas, making it difficult for the villagers to mount any effective defense. By exploiting ethnic divisions and supporting the Arab militias, the government could suppress the rebellions and maintain control over Darfur for a time at least. However, this strategy came at a tremendous human cost, plunging the region into a cycle of violence and suffering. The carnage of Kudum was replicated across the region. Similar scenes unfolded in Bendi and Mokjar within the same year. In Bendi, the Janjaweed attacked with such ferocity that the entire village was virtually wiped out. Eyewitnesses reported that the attackers showed no mercy, killing anyone they encountered and committing widespread sexual violence. The pattern repeated in Mokjar, where the Janjaweed not only killed and raped, but also looted homes and destroyed vital infrastructure, ensuring that the survivors had little to return to. The long-term impact on these communities was devastating. The immediate loss of life and property was compounded by the psychological trauma inflicted on the survivors. Many were forced to seek refuge in overcrowded and under-resourced IDP camps, where they faced further hardships including disease, malnutrition, and continued insecurity. The town of Tawila in North Darfur experienced one of the most notorious Janjaweed attacks in 2004. On the 27th of February, the Janjaweed, supported by Sudanese government forces, launched a coordinated assault on the town. The attack was brutal and targeted a densely populated area, resulting in a high number of casualties. Eyewitness accounts described the scene as one of utter devastation. The attackers killed over 100 people and abducted more than 150 women and children. Many of the abducted women were subjected to rape, while homes and markets were looted and burned, and the town's infrastructure was again targeted. The significance of the Tawila attack extended beyond the immediate destruction. It highlighted the Sudanese government's complicity in the violence and drew widespread international condemnation. The United Nations, human rights organizations, and various governments around the world called for urgent action to protect civilians and hold the perpetrators accountable. However, despite the outcry, effective international intervention remained elusive, and the cycle of violence simply continued. Even the supposed sanctuaries of IDP camps were not safe from the Janjaweed's reach. The Kalma camp in South Darfur, one of the largest camps for displaced persons, became the site of a horrific massacre in August 2008. On the 25th, the Janjaweed, along with the Sudanese government forces, attacked the camp under the pretext of searching for weapons and rebels. The assault quickly turned into a massacre. Armed men opened fire on the camp's residents, killing dozens and wounding many more. The attackers also set fire to shelters, destroying what little the displaced people had managed to salvage from their former lives. The psychological impact on the survivors of the Kalma camp massacre was profound. Many had already endured the trauma of fleeing their homes and witnessing atrocities, and the attack on the camp shattered any sense of security that they might have had. The humanitarian implications were equally dire, as the destruction of shelters and resources left many without adequate protection, food, or medical care. Again, the international community expressed outrage and called for accountability, but meaningful action remained limited. The Kalma camp massacre underscored the urgent need for stronger international measures to protect civilians and address the root causes of the violence in Darfur. Thought the Wagner Group was only in Ukraine? Well, think again. The Wagner Group, a private military company with close ties to the Russian government, has long been a significant player in various conflict zones worldwide, including Sudan. The group first established its presence in Sudan during the tenure of President Omar al-Bashir. Facing international isolation and internal rebellion, Bashir sought external support to bolster his regime. Russia, seeking to expand its influence in Africa, saw an opportunity and forged a strategic alliance with Sudan. The Wagner Group's involvement in this country included training and equipping Sudanese forces, providing strategic military advice, and participating directly in combat operations. Their presence has been particularly noted in Darfur, where they've reportedly supported the government and the Janjaweed against rebel groups. The group's operations in Sudan are not purely military. They are also deeply intertwined with economic interests. The group's involvement in the Sudanese gold mining industry is well documented. Reports indicate that Wagner has secured lucrative mining concessions, allowing them to extract and export gold. This arrangement provides a financial lifeline to the group and its Russian backers, while also giving the Sudanese government a source of revenue to fund its military operations. Between 2003 and 2008, hundreds of thousands were killed and millions were displaced as the Janjaweed targeted civilian populations across Darfur. While uprisings in the south led to the formation of South Sudan, the population of Darfur was not so lucky. The Janjaweed and Sudanese military were able to turn the tide against the SLA and the JEM, who, after several setbacks, were both splintering by 2007. Despite the horrors increasingly reported by Western media, the Sudanese government was regaining control of Darfur. International pressure from the United States and the European Union led to various sanctions against the Sudanese government, while the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for key figures, including President Omar al-Bashir, on charges of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Several rounds of peace talks were held, most notably the Abuja peace talks in 2006 and the Doha peace process in 2011. The Abuja agreement, signed only by one faction of the Sudan Liberation Army, or SLA, failed to bring comprehensive peace and was rejected by other major rebel groups. The Doha Document for Peace in Darfur, signed in 2011, aimed to address issues such as power sharing, wealth distribution, and justice for victims. While it represented a step forward, its implementation has been inconsistent, and many rebel factions remained outside the agreement. The effectiveness of these efforts has been mixed. While they have succeeded in bringing some level of international attention and pressure to the conflict, they have often been undermined by a lack of unified support from the international community and the intransigence of the Sudanese government and rebel groups. In South Sudan, the initial euphoria of independence quickly gave way to internal strife. By December 2013, South Sudan plunged into a civil war driven by political rivalry and ethnic tensions. Efforts by the international community to mediate and bring peace have seen some progress and significant setbacks. By 2018, it was estimated that 400,000 people had died as a result of violence, disease, and malnutrition. The impact of the Janjaweed on the demographics of Darfur has been profound and far-reaching. The violence and terror unleashed by this militia have led to one of the largest displacement crises in modern history. Over 2 million people have been forced to flee their homes, seeking refuge in internally displaced persons, IDP camps within Sudan or neighboring countries like Chad. The displacement statistics paint a grim picture. According to reports from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, more than 300,000 Darfuris have sought asylum in Chad, where they live in overcrowded refugee camps. Within Sudan, the IDP camps are similarly overwhelmed, struggling to provide essential services to the displaced people. These camps are often makeshift and lack adequate sanitation, healthcare, and security, making life extremely difficult. The effects extend beyond the IDPs, though. Urban areas in Darfur have seen a significant influx of displaced persons, straining already limited infrastructure. Towns like Al Fasher and Nyala have experienced rapid population growth, leading to overcrowded schools, insufficient healthcare facilities, and increased competition for jobs and housing. The social fabric of these urban centers is under immense pressure as they struggle to accommodate the displaced population. Neighboring countries, particularly Chad, have also been affected by the influx of refugees. The sudden increase in population has put a strain on local resources and has sometimes led to tensions between refugees and host communities. Additionally, the presence of large refugee populations has implications for regional security as the instability in Darfur spills over into neighboring regions. Achieving lasting peace in Darfur faces numerous obstacles. The ongoing violence and insecurity in the region continues to pose significant challenges. Militia groups, including remnants of the Janjaweed, still operate with impunity, and interethnic tensions remain high. Political instability further complicates the peace process. The overthrow of President Omar al-Bashir in 2019 brought hope for change, but the transitional government's efforts to address the conflict have been slow and fraught with difficulties. The power struggles with Sudan's political landscape and economic hardships have hindered progress towards a sustainable peace. The name Janjaweed became horrifyingly familiar during the darkest years of the Darfur crisis, but with mounting international condemnation, they soon faded into the background. And yet, of course, they weren't gone for good. In the last few years, a new group, the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, has begun raining carnage down on the region, seemingly intent on finishing the genocide that started just over 20 years ago. The RSF are not new. They are simply the Janjaweed rebranded, and their reappearance has coincided with a surge in atrocities. The Sudanese city of El Janina has perhaps seen the worst, with a recently unearthed mass grave containing more than 1,000 bodies of men, women, and children. The city saw waves of attack by the RSF, with military and police reportedly standing by and allowing death to sweep through. As many as 500,000 have now been displaced across Darfur, with terror sweeping the region once again. This is the war we never hear about. This is the world's shady genocide that we don't like to talk about.